welcome to the Disney Therapist Podcast. I am your host, Tyler, here with
Alan.
I was like, I should just say my whole name and my license and all that. Like, no, just Tyler. Okay.
Right.
This podcast is focused on all things Disney and Disney related, and I am like really loud in my ear, so I'm messing with it. So sorry for that, you guys. All things therapy, mental health, psyche, and Disney. So what we do is we break down Disney movies and discuss them and discuss themes and archetypes and emotions and relationship status. Anything. It's pretty much what happens when you get two therapists who like Disney together. They watch something and we dive into it. So that's a little bit about the podcast. We just launched in the last month or so. So we're really excited about the growth of the podcast. And I wanted to read a review which said, this podcast shows how different Disney characters and storylines relate to real life and how we are all similar. This has helped me have a better understanding of myself and some personal relationships. Even if you're not a big Disney fan, you will understand the content and use the information in your daily life. Oh, really like that. So
Right.
if you posted that, if you did that, take a screenshot and email me, and we will send you a free little gift, a little sticker. Mm-hmm. I thought they were bigger when I ordered them, but we have some, so they're only for if you leave us a review and you message us on the disneytherapist.com/review. You can see the different ways you can message us to get the free gift, because we just want to give that out for anybody who is listening. So that is all that I have for the intro. Yeah. Do you have anything to say?
Nope, I think you did a good job.
3 more and you'll be doing this whole intro thing.
Right. Everyone had to hear my anxiety come out as I try to do that.
We should make that episode all about anxiety as you do it. That would be fun.
We could. We
haven't scheduled it yet. So, okay. So today is kind of a heavy topic.
Yes.
It is all about grief. Mm-hmm. And obviously we're going to be talking a lot about death in Disney movies and grief. And so it's going to be a hard topic, but I think if anybody's experienced grief, hearing more about grief can be really helpful. If you've never experienced death or in your life, this can be helpful so you can start to figure out how to connect with people when they do. Mm-hmm. Because one of the most awkward things when you lose someone in your life is people don't know how to respond. And I actually think that the movies we pick teach us how people respond and then how to respond to people.
A bit. Something that I think is more thematic and something that we've talked about, I think, in a couple episodes ago, is Disney does a great job at showing you the most basic level of a concern. And so with grief, I think they do a great job of getting us connected to characters and showing us loss. But Disney has this very magical way of giving us the perfect resolution. And I think it's important for us to talk about the murkiness that these characters go through off screen.
Absolutely. That actually brings up, I don't know if I told you this beforehand, is I found a study that's on death in Disney movies.
Okay.
I'll post it in the show notes so you can get a link to it and see it all. Mm-hmm. But it talks about deaths actually happen in almost every single animated Disney movie.
I believe it.
It's very, very common that somebody dies. Either it's the villain or it's an antagonist. And what they found is it's usually justified or unjustified. Okay. They looked at what causes the death. Mm-hmm. And for villains, their deaths are usually justified. And for heroes, their deaths are unjustified.
Okay.
Which kind of, I think, speaks to how what you just said, which is Disney likes to paint it in a very certain picture, right? Yeah. Very rarely does does death ever justified. It's just a part of life. But it's almost we, in telling these stories, we have to have some type of morality around it to be able to conceptualize it better. So some of the movies I know I picked on the list today are all about there's not a lot of justification. It's more about the grief after the fact, not necessarily during. So we'll get into that shortly.
That's a really interesting comment. I forget if it was a Disney movie I was watching or if it was just some kind of content I was watching, where I was talking about how they set you up. When they don't want you to overemphasize maybe a death of a character, they make sure to paint them in a bad light first. Mm-hmm. And so I think what you're talking about is Disney has a certain story they like to tell, and they like to empower heroism, and they like to kind of root out villainy.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting as we kind of go through this list and we find ways to talk about that, how we can kind of inject that in some of this process.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking, you just said that, it made me think of, spoiler for all the movies released or TV shows, Orange is the New Black.
Yes.
I forget which season, where one of the main characters gets killed.
Which one?
Oh, yeah, that's true. That happens in a few different seasons. What's her name?
She's a very charismatic character.
Yeah, she's the one who was the prisoner who was suffocated by the guard.
I think it's Poussey.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that or any of the stuff with that. But one of the things the writers said that they did was they really worked hard in that show, that whole season, to never have her step one foot out of line. Yeah. Because it's so easy to place blame or do other things when it comes to death. So it's either totally justified or unjustified. So I think when we're discussing all this stuff, it's really important for us to look at all those different layers of what's causing, not causing death, but all the different factors of how we try to process it.
Yeah, all the circumstances. Because I think that kind of what you're leading to is that I think in these stories they try to do very black and white.
Yes.
At least Disney does very black and white deaths. And maybe it's important for us to kind of enliven that gray space to help maybe, one, I know it's always helpful for me to process this stuff because it helps me kind of stay on my toes, and also help everybody who's listening, everybody who's watching, to consider and not to concretize anything.
Yeah.
Because I think that we get in trouble when we like to do black and white thinking.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts before we jump into the first examples?
I don't think so. I think we covered it. Kind of the biggest things, right? One, spoiler alert, because we're literally going to go over deaths and grief. So that's going to just kind of shake up every story. And then also to remember that Disney does a great job of teasing. And hopefully we're going to add some depth to, and understanding to maybe what they're teasing at, and to kind of reach. Because, right, we're doing things and we're processing things that aren't on screen.
Yeah.
We're being very subjective about how we view it and how we would talk about it.
We're going to do a lot of the classic therapist question. I wonder if, what could this be?
Yeah, and I think that's really important, especially when we talk about some of these character deaths and what they go through, because something that you had hinted on, I think, during the Star Wars podcast was we get attached to a character and we have a way we think the character is and what they're doing, and we might step on some toes here.
Of course, that's okay though.
Right.
We're doing it with optimism, and we're lovingly sharing our thoughts. There's no judgment.
Yeah, we're just creating that gray space for some of these characters. Yes. And you get to decide where you want that character to live.
What's your first movie character that you wanted to dive into?
So for me, I think one of the big ones is Finding Nemo. Right, this is one of those movies where Disney starts off right away with the tear-jerking scene, right? And of course, I want to focus on kind of Marlin and his experience. So we see that he begins the movie very carefree, very playful, very fun, and then this tragedy happens. He loses a lot of his kids and his wife, and I want to amplify kind of a symptom of grief, which is hypervigilance. And I think it's really interesting because when you watch it, right, you see him as overprotective, you see him as kind of smothering, and he just kind of seems avoidant.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's they go hand in hand. He's avoidant, he's hypervigilant, and he's trying to shelter Nemo. But something that I think happens is that it fosters naivety in Nemo. So it's interesting, right, because he spends the entire first part of the movie trying to shelter him and keep him safe. But it's actually his avoidance that fosters this space where Nemo's ambivalence to this information, he can't connect with Marlin, so he doesn't trust Marlin, and it leads to his biggest fear, right? And I think that's really interesting because we armor up and we protect ourselves thinking that we're protecting ourselves from this great fear that's on the outside, but all we've done is actually we took our eyes off of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's so scary.
That he was so traumatized at all of this loss,
yes,
that it made him so anxious that he would avoid everything. But in avoiding everything, it created the environment that Nemo built resentment.
Yes.
Right? And he wasn't processing why he was doing it or trying to work through it. He was just avoiding. And then that causes Nemo to touch the boat.
Yes, or touch the butt.
Yeah, touch the butt.
So it's interesting. We were having a conversation about cliches.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna use one. What is it? Keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. So something because of his anxiety and his avoidance of that material,
Yeah.
he kept himself from engaging with his enemy, which is, maybe the difficulty and the fear of the outside world. And because he kept his eyes off it, and he was so over-focused on protecting Nemo, it's actually, I think, right, this is where that gray space is going to be. I think that his negligence to Nemo right there is what causes Nemo to take this extreme risk and to get captured.
Yeah.
Right, and then I think through the journey, right, as he goes out and as he tackles danger after danger after danger, he is learning how to navigate the dangers of the world, right? We see him like this is how he heals through trauma and how he's kind of honor that grief. And when he comes back, right, he has all these stories and he has this confidence that, I'm going to handle things. He's not avoiding it.
Yeah, I can get through this.
Yes, and I think that that's a healthy way of navigating it when we have to step into the thing that creates that fear and to understand it.
Yeah. So, full disclosure, I was like, I'm going to share a lot of more personal stuff today. So my mom passed last year, and it just hit me when you were talking about kind of like how this experience like fundamentally shifted Marlon.
Yes.
And now I look at my dad, and he's not a different person, but the way we're talking about things, the way he's showing up and doing the stuff, it feels so different since my mom passed, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that in a way, what it shows is like when someone experiences the loss of someone close, it fundamentally shifts their psyche. Something's going on, and depending on maybe the support system, depending on belief, depending on the ability to like look within, will determine like where you fall, right? Some people could become really, really depressed.
Yes.
Some people like Marlon could become really, really anxious. Some people like my dad might really dislike their employer, right? Like, so I think that it fundamentally shifts based on experiencing like that trauma.
Yes. And I think it's important, right, it's got to be really hard to be in that situation and to recognize that you've made a shift. Right, you're trying to adjust to this new information about the world, information that you always intellectually knew, but never had to feel.
Yep.
And I think that that's where we need to be able to connect and be able to share that, because we've gone through something so traumatic and something so big, and our brain, our mind, our soul is trying to make things okay. Yeah. And so, right, so if we just get really hypervigilant, if we get just really anxious, we're never going to experience that again, and that's fine. But we get so obsessed with that, like that protection, that we don't see how that protection is actually pushing us further away.
Yeah, it's keeping us more stuck.
Yes.
Versus, one of the things I'll tell clients all the time is like holding that space, right? Holding pain. Like you just sometimes have to feel pain, which is awful.
Yes.
Like it's not like we're not saying that this is the best outcome is like, okay, experience pain or feel pain. But when you actually can embrace it, right? If Marlon could have embraced the hurt and the sadness, then he'd be in a very different space.
I think what you said is resonating, and it's taking a second for me to find words to describe kind of where my mind is going. Holding space, sitting with pain, they're all uncomfortable.
Very.
And I think we use this phrase a lot, and I know a lot of clients who get frustrated with me when I say it, that we need to respect or we need to honor the grief. And I think that's what you're saying, is that creating that space is how we honor that something big has just happened. And if we don't honor it, we don't respect how big it is, we can't feel the effects, we can't feel the emotion, and we can't talk about what happens next.
Absolutely. We
crystallize. Right? So when we talk about clients being stuck, when we talk about feeling stagnant, I think it's because we get so concretized and we say, this is what's going on. We actually haven't aged a day since that moment happened.
That right there is a perfect segue. The next movie that I have on my list, right? Yes. Getting Stuck, is because I listed this and you were like, what? So I listed Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Because the reason I like this movie in the sense of it talks about grief is Eddie, who's the detective in the movie. If you've not watched it in a while, you should go rewatch it. Yeah. He is stuck, right? He's just kind of living his life. He's a drunk,
Yes.
Right? It's not like you think of it as a Disney like kid movie, but there's a lot of adult themes throughout the whole movie, right? That he's stuck because his brother was killed, right?
Yes.
So he's doing the same things. He's doing bottom line like detective work. He's not really doing what he used to do, and you can see that. And then even in The Office, right? There's the scene where Roger's in there, and he like touches the chair and like pulls it back, and he yells at him like, "No, that's my brother's chair," and said it. And there's just like dust everywhere, which just shows that like he's stuck in his grief. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to move forward. He doesn't know how to process it. So he's just sitting in it.
Yes. And as you say that, right, he's doing the bare minimum to keep life moving forward, but he's not truly living.
Not until Roger comes in.
Yes, and shakes things up.
Yes. That's where I think I like thinking of this movie, because a lot of times if you've never experienced like a close personal loss and you're trying to connect with people, the worst things you can say is, "How are you doing right now?" Awful.
Rightfully so.
Awful.
Yeah.
Like there's no great way to like connect. And I like the way like Roger builds a friendship with him, because he's just focused on like being present and having fun and being connected. Obviously he's a cartoon, so he's going to do the cartoony stuff.
Yes.
But he just constantly is showing up, right?
Yes.
Like the fact that he even handcuffs himself to Eddie, where he could easily get out at any time, but he chooses to stay. I think kind of shows like maybe what we can learn from how to show up for people who are grieving is just being around.
Yeah.
Is the most powerful thing you can do.
Yes. Like there's so much I want to
I always love when I like make a point and your response is like, "Yes." That's exactly it.
I'm going to bring up the archetype that we had talked about in Star Wars.
Okay.
Really, Roger Rabbit gets to play the fool.
Yep.
Right? He could either shame the detective at every moment, right? He could say, well, you know, he could forcefully confront these things in a very criticizing way. But instead, he rolls with the punches. He allows him to live out his narrative, and he's just there. You know, and he tips the scale in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, it just hit me too that we're looking at this from like maybe a more global side of like how the movie kind of deals with grief. Is Roger in that movie is going through his own stuff, right? He thinks his wife's cheating on him. He's doing all these, and he brings it to Eddie.
Yes.
Right. And there's a little bit of conflict and all this stuff, but I think it also shows that just because someone is going through a hard time dealing with a loss doesn't mean you can't share your feelings and your stuff with them.
That was so big, because my thoughts were how isolating that's got to feel to feel like that you enter a room now and then everybody gets impersonal.
Yeah. I'm not going to share my stuff with you anymore because you're going through so much.
Yeah. So you're already feeling lost. You're already feeling disconnected. And now you're getting this identity projected onto you that you're some kind of, you know, there's like a plague going on, like avoid at all costs.
I think this is where one of the birthplaces of the lack of vulnerability exists, is that we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So what we tend to do is pull back, right? Or we do the culturally nicety thing. So we went to, in my experience with this, so my mom passed away last summer, and then I was visiting my father around Christmas time, and we went to a funeral because we had a family member pass away. As we're kind of like in the viewing area, every person who came up to my father goes, "How are you doing? How are you doing?" And he's like, "How do you think I'm doing?"
Yeah.
Like, my wife of 40 years passed away. Like,
yeah,
this is awful.
Yeah.
It's like, But because people didn't know what to say,
yeah,
we try to give like connection without giving any part of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Asking how someone's doing, especially when you know that they've experienced a big loss, is actually not being vulnerable with it, right?
Yeah.
Versus like, "Hey, I'm thinking of you. Like, if you need anything, call me." Like, that just feels so different because I'm actually having to give myself and be open to what you're feeling.
Yeah, you know, we get so caught up and tied up in thinking that there's maybe a perfect way of addressing it that we actually become fake. We become disingenuous. And sometimes it's not just, "Hey, I'm thinking of you." It might just be, "Hey, I'm here. I'm here if you need me. I don't know what to say. right? And I think you've referenced before that Brene Brown,
Yeah.
Someone animated it, and it's
Yeah.
great, where the guy walks into like this cave and goes, "Hey, it's kind of damp and dark down here. I don't know what to say, but I'm here."
I'll link to it again in the show notes,
Yeah.
and on our YouTube channel, I'll put a little card or a link in the description. I'll also link to the last podcast episode where we talk about like the full archetype.
Yes.
So you can see all that. So it'll be in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it will be in the description down below.
Yeah. So if they didn't want to rewatch it at the beginning of this, I hope that everybody wants to rewatch it, because I know that I do, because it has been a while since I've watched it, and like this new perspective of these characters, I'm really interested to see kind of what it does for me.
Well, I mean, maybe even thinking about like how we identified in Finding Nemo that Marlin got stuck, right?
Yes.
Like that was the big thing, that he got stuck, but he got stuck in anxiety.
Yes.
Eddie got stuck.
Mm-hmm.
He got stuck in alcoholism.
Yes.
Right. And I actually think, looking at the list that we have, one of the common themes of somebody who's experiencing a loss is they get stuck.
Yeah.
And I don't think they get stuck at any fault of their own. I think they get stuck because they don't necessarily have the support system or the resources. Plus, it's a movie. So they need to be stuck to be able to have growth. So hopefully we can like keep looking about like what does it take to get unstuck. And that actually might be a good segue to our next movie.
Yes, but before we
go
get
ahead.
there,
Yeah.
As you talk about how they get stuck, and I want to propose kind of a curiosity, and I wonder if they get stuck on the first thing that provides relief.
I think that could definitely be it.
Right. So we'll
Yeah,
put
put a pause
pin
on
in
that.
it, right, and we'll see how that kind of continues
Okay.
to show up. But as we move into this next one.
So
Yes.
thank you guys so much for listening as you're trying to talk. Do you want to try this?
No.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for listening. We really appreciate it. Obviously, this is all off the cuff. We're just kind of going, I don't even know what I'm saying. We'll see how much of this makes it through, but I have a minute to fill for my break. So please like and subscribe if you are enjoying this podcast. It really means a lot. Make sure you leave a review, because that helps the podcast continue to grow. Like us on YouTube, all that fun jazz. And then we have the question of the day, which is, what death or grief from a movie has really affected you the most? So think of a movie, and it could be a Disney movie or un-Disney movie. Un-Disney, like
Yes.
that. How has that affected you? Would love to hear a little bit more about that. So with that, we are going to get back to the podcast. Okay, so we're back, and we said let's put a pin in it.
Yes.
We're going to unpin it, but I think we're going to actually answer that question through talking about the next movie that you put on your list. So that is
Lion King. And so for me, I think that, because we talked about Simba, I think, before, but in this one, talking about how his...
Healthy Relationships, Part 1. We talked about Simba. Yeah, Part 1. We talked about Simba.
Okay. For me, I wanted to talk about Simba with grief, because as we talked about in the Healthy Relationship, and as I kind of was rewatching scenes, realizing that his trauma is so big, he can't go near it. Right? So when the scene happens, when Mufasa passes away and he runs, and we see him, end up in the paradise with Timon and Pumbaa, right? I feel like that there's like a moment that happens where he leaves behind the grief and he ends up in paradise.
Yeah.
Right? Like that image to me, it didn't sit well. Right? Because it's like this fantasy that if we just get away from it, if we just ignore it, if we just find a place that looks happier and perfect, that we won't have to deal with it. But I love, right, as we continue watching the story, the grief infiltrates when Nala shows up.
Yeah. Okay.
So to really paint the picture, right, like in this paradise, predators and prey all get along. They eat, the only non-sentient animal, which are bugs.
Yeah.
Right? So like I think they really leaned into paradise. Actually, this is gonna sound really bad. I don't know what they named that place. I don't know if there is a name for it.
I don't think there's a name in the movie.
Is there?
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, I don't know. But so he's in paradise, and he grows up and he ages in paradise, and he's ambivalent and he's happy-go-lucky. And then Nala shows up, and immediately he gets sucked back into
Reality hits him.
Yes.
Literally, Rafiki hits him.
Sorry, that was loud. I forgot about that. but yeah, he's now forced to address all these things that he has left to the wayside. And I think that kind of is like thematically, like with therapy, is I think that clients, like the dams that they have built sometimes break. And so they don't have access to what's going on because it happened so long ago.
Well, it makes me think of even beyond just like dealing with grief. Like we're looking at grief and death and our response to it, right? Because grief and death is a trauma, right? Which I hate using therapy words, but it's a trauma that we all have to experience at some point in our life.
Yeah.
Right. And that if I take a more global view of trauma, what do we like to do? We like to escape and go to the place that is all, rainforest and waterfalls, and it's beautiful and it's paradise, and I don't need to deal with my trauma. And I think that we all do that, right? And it's just a matter of what that escape mechanism is, and that if we don't deal with trauma, if we don't deal with grief, if we don't deal with these things, just like Nala, it's going to sneak up and eat one of our friends.
Try to. Depends how ambivalent we are.
Yeah.
Right, and pulling the pin out again, right? He gets stuck in paradise, right? The first soothing thing that happened. I don't want to say first, right? I want to make sure that in these movies, we see it as the first.
Yeah.
But it's just the most effective and the most easily accessible.
And his friends enabled him. And it wasn't a bad thing. We talked about like the friendships, and it was a good... those friendships are a good thing, but I think I even made the observation, but they made bad decisions.
Yes. And yes, right? So in this story, we can see how being in paradise was the alleviation from it, but he wasn't able to address it. So it was just still out there. And how interesting, right? Like as he's in this paradise that's flourishing, his home is withering, right? And in one of my notes, something that I think was important for me to remind myself is when he gets back, it's literally on fire.
Yeah.
Right. Like it kind of shows that he's neglected his home. He's neglected this very rich part of his history. And how beautiful is it that when he finally finds that courage to confront Scar, and the movie resolves, it rains.
Yeah.
It's kind of showing that it's important for us to put out those fires, and that when we step into it, when we work through it, that we can begin to reinvigorate that space.
That we can run away from our trauma, our grief, or we can lean into it. And when we lean into it, it's painful.
Yeah.
But it's healing.
And animated TV series aside, who would have liked and who would have watched Lion King if he went to paradise and the movie ended? He just grew up, he lived there, he ate bugs the rest of his life, and that was it.
It's been super disappointing.
Yes.
Right, there's something in like our soul. It's kind of what I think we talked about at the end of Star Wars, right? Like there's certain moments that like the audience cheers.
Yes.
And we need those conclusions in that way. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like a satisfying ending.
It's how we heal, or how we connect to healing, as we watch and we get these narratives that inspire us.
We have to, if we talk about like the hero's journey, right? We have to travel to the depths, fight the demon, come back up, right? We have to come back up changed. And that really, the reason that the hero's journey exists is because it's telling us we're all on our own hero's journey. Like we have to face certain things sometimes. And one of those things will be grief and some of these traumas that have happened to us. And when I say trauma too, like I think we discount things that happen in our life because we don't feel like it's traumatic enough.
I help clients by teaching them that there's a difference between big T trauma and little t trauma. All trauma is relevant, but I think that you're right. We get so over-identified with, well, mine's not that bad, or I heard about this horrible thing over here, so mine doesn't count.
Yeah.
And so helping clients recognize that there's two ways of going about it. I either help clients become comfortable with using the word trauma, or I introduce them to the word wounds.
Yeah, I like the word wounds better.
I use it more often, but we all experience wounds and nicks along the way. And if we don't treat them, we don't take care of them, what happens? They get infected.
Yep. Yeah, and when we think about wounds and like grief and some of these big things that just follow us, I think I like to imagine wounds in a few different ways, right? I could have like a scar. It's healed, right?
Poignant.
But I know why it's there. I learned from it. Like I'm not gonna have a scar on my finger. Not gonna open a can that way, the same way again.
Yes.
Or I could have a wound where I injured my foot running, and every time I run, it hurts. right? So it's a wound that's healed, but I still feel it, right? And then that's why I like using the word wound, because sometimes we really get through things and we just can remember them and that's what they are. Then other times things we just have to be really cautious of, right? That if I'm going to go for a run, I need to wrap my ankle. I need to be thoughtful. I need to go a little bit slower. I need to pay attention. I need to stretch, right? And that we all have to pay attention to these things that are wounds in our life, and learn how to work through them.
Because just like kind of recalling back to Finding Nemo, right? Because if we don't, we can foster this naivety that invites that trauma again, or that wound, right? That wound can happen again if we're not paying attention.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking of the runner. You don't wrap your foot. You go out for a nice jog.
Have you ever injured yourself? Yeah.
Shin splints.
Oh, okay. I was like, we both run. So
Yeah.
not Disney related, but we both like to run. Well, it is Disney related. I'll be running the Dopey race here in January.
Yeah.
So before we move past Lion King, the one last piece that really stood out to me, because we keep talking about like Be in Paradise, and I think I might have alluded this in a previous episode too, which is like, to me, that escapism, right, is numbing, right? Which is why one thing that I think people struggle with when they think of people who have addictions, is addictions are fun.
Yes.
Right? And I'm not encouraging addictions. I'm not saying that they are helpful or they're healthy for you or anything like that.
Yeah.
But they are fun. Like the reason why people turn to drinking, porn, overeating, over shopping, any of these escapism, addictive type behaviors is because in the moment it feels good. It is paradise.
Yes.
And if we're not cautious, some things that are fun can feel like such a good escape. It then becomes something that is no longer healthy. It's no longer helping us. So we always need to pay attention to kind of our escapism behaviors. Like we all have them. I tend to go down YouTube rabbit holes. You're a video
games.
Right? Like we have our own things, but I can find like sometimes when I have a really stressful day or I don't want to deal with something, I immediately go into that escape space.
Yes. It's adaptive, right? Like we go through these experiences and we find something that just provides relief. And I don't know, and I'm sure you have, I don't want to assume, but there's those days when you have a really rough time and you go to your escape and it's not working.
Yeah.
And how unhealthy we might treat that thing, right? You know, to anybody who is watching who plays video games, that time when you open up your game, you hover over the play button for 30 minutes, you close it, you walk out, you get something to eat, you come back, you try it again for another 30 minutes.
It just isn't working.
Yeah, because
you're forcing it.
Yes, because we've projected this idea that this is always going to save us from our feelings. And so now this thing that we love is starting to become like, we're starting to foster kind of this love-hate relationship. And it's not the game or like, right, games for me. Yeah. It's not that experience that's doing it, but just this thing in our subconscious or unconscious that's just needing to be attended to.
And we don't know how.
Yes.
Because we've don't always developed the ways, and this fun thing has always felt like it helps. But and that's where stuff can become a compulsion.
Yes.
Right? When I feel like I have to do this because this is the only thing that will make me feel better. And that's where escalation happens. That's where instead of just drinking a little, I'm drinking a lot more, or I'm using a little, I'm using a lot more, or I have to play my game for hours to try to feel better or escape, even though it's not helping.
Yes. You know, when we talk about, if you ever hear me reference complexes or being compelled to, like that's one of those moments that we get compelled because we've projected and said, this is the thing. Yeah. Right. And I think it's anytime we concretize one thing as just this, we don't make space for it to be anything else. And if it's not working, we don't have no access to creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. So that
I do want to comment.
Go ahead.
And I don't know why. It's just something if I don't say, I think it's going to get at me. This is where I hate when people say, I've had a rough day. I just need to blank. Right. The common reference, I need a beer. Yeah. Where I think that we have almost created this culture where that's okay. And I'm not against, right? You have a long day. You want to grab a beer, fine. But I hate this idea that we can just say that I've had a bad day. We don't talk about it. We don't address it. And we just go do this one thing. That
you don't need to have a bad day to be able to have a beer, right?
Yes.
And this is something I say to clients, slightly off Grief, but we'll get back to Grief right after this, which is I do a soapbox speech, right? And I say, if you're going to use a substance, I don't care what type of substance it is. If you're going to use a substance, make sure it's magnifying something, an emotion that you're already feeling, right?
Yeah.
If you're having a bad day, you're feeling down, you're feeling stressed, that is not the time to escape from it, right?
Yeah.
If you're having a great time, you're feeling joy and happiness at a picnic and you want to have a beer, have a beer.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what is a substance doing for you in that moment, right? If you're going to play a video game because you're having a good day and you want to like continue to have fun, go play a video game for a bit.
Yes.
But if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling worried, that might turning to those things to escape isn't helpful, right? So it's all about what is it magnifying? Is it helping you experiencing an emotion, or is it helping you escape it? If it's escapism, it probably shouldn't be used.
Yeah, and bringing it back in, this is relevant,
Yeah.
Because as we talk about these situations in grief, what we're recognizing is that, thematically so far, that there is this projected escape, right? And so we're understanding kind of how we end up in that place, and we're also seeing, this is where I think Disney does the too perfect, is we're hopefully enlivening that gray space where we can see kind of where they got addicted to something and kind of what is required for them to kind of reach towards the conclusion of these movies.
So that brings us to the next movie, which we're not going to spend nearly as much time on, I don't think. But I thought was important to last because I think it's the first experience well, maybe not for you. Lion King might have been for you. For me, this was the first movie, Disney movie, that you experience death.
Yeah.
That's sudden. It comes out of nowhere.
Abrupt.
Right?
Like it's like right there.
So if you haven't guessed yet, it's Bambi, right? And there's not a lot there. The reason I wanted to list this in like the grief episode is because death happens quickly.
Yes.
Like sometimes people have the ability to kind of prepare and be okay. And okay is not even the right word, but to be able to process it a little bit differently. But for most, it happens really suddenly.
Yeah.
Just like, and in Bambi, it's they're running, and then mom's gone, and he's calling out for her until dad shows up and says she's gone.
Yeah.
Right, and then that's pretty much the conclusion of the grief in that movie. Yeah. But it's a really shocking space.
Yeah.
When you're watching the first time, especially if you're a kid, like it's just like, oh, it happened.
Yeah.
But then the movie does not address any part of that, and I thought that would be important to talk about right now, which is death can be really sudden, and we almost don't know what to do with it when it comes out of nowhere.
I think the come out of nowhere piece is so big because as I'm sitting with it, I've shared with you that but Bambi probably was the first time. I just never liked it. I was very young. I haven't given it another chance, but I think that what you're talking about is that this is an off-screen death. Mm-hmm. I think that's so important because how often are we not there?
Yeah.
And what that could speak to how we identify with ourselves. How we it's almost like this narrative we create, like what happens if we're not there when someone dies, so we don't get to see it, so we have to imagine this death now, and that's traumatic.
Absolutely.
And then also having to navigate kind of the societal pressure of like, where was I?
Makes me think of my 93-year-old grandmother, who's still doing really well. She was not present for her father's death and her brother's death.
Okay.
And that's something that every person who's been close to passing away, she's always had to be there, right? That somehow that really influenced her in quite a bit. And I think even in my own experience, this was just like 2 days ago this happened. My mom got re-diagnosed with cancer a year ago, like 2 or 3 days ago, and she died 68 days later.
Yeah.
And it was like, boom. And we didn't realize it. Like we even talking with my dad about this as we came up on this anniversary, because Facebook memories and all this stuff kind of come up. It was fast, and we didn't realize how fast it was. But luckily, we had 68 days. Yeah. Not everybody gets all that. Yeah. So I think there's no way to ever prepare, but just being aware that like life is short, I think can help us understand and steer into this stuff more. And one of the strengths that my family had in processing a death is we've all leaned into it. Like we're all talking a lot more, we're processing a lot more. So I think we're all in a much healthier space to be able to work through it. And I would say the family members that I have that aren't doing that are struggling a lot more.
It's to really reference kind of your previous comment about like the runner, right? Once we are aware of how much something can hurt, we're going to do what we can to make sure that we don't hurt like that again.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move into the last little section before we take a break, which is I put villains. Okay.
And I'm curious what you meant by that, because there's so, I think that you, as we were talking, you had shared that you had this beautiful insight about villains. And I know this really calls back to kind of what we were teasing at the beginning. And so I'm curious kind of where you want to take that. I've got some comments on villains. I don't know if you want me to.
I was like, I'm reading my notes right this second. I'm like, what did I write?
So maybe we can kind of kick off with, maybe I can introduce kind of my thoughts, right?
Yeah, go for it.
Because you had shared that villains just sometimes die. And I think that you
They're
were upset.
always justified.
Yeah, and I think that you were very charged with that. And one of my comments was, well, maybe it's because hopefully by the end of the movie, our hero has integrated the aspect the villain represented. And so when we talk about justified, one of the places my mind is bringing it is maybe it's justified for sometimes these villains to die because the character has adopted the aspect that the villain was maybe over amplifying. So like Scar, for example.
Yeah.
Scar is this sneaky aggression. Yeah. And Simba has none. Simba's naive. He's a kid.
Yeah.
And I think by the end of the movie, right, because it actually happens in the final conflict. Simba tries to be, once again, he's naive and he's too innocent and he's not willing to assert, right? Because he has an opportunity to win against Scar and he doesn't.
Yeah.
And what happens? Scar takes advantage of that. And so in that situation, I think that Simba now is forced to learn how to have a healthy aggression when it's necessary. So Scar is no longer relevant because Simba has integrated the healthy aspect of aggression and is able to discern the difference between Scar's unhealthy aggression and his aggression.
I feel like this could be a whole other episode, which we might have to write down in the notes, of looking at the hero's villain and how they conquered their villain from the movie.
Yeah. Are you ready for this one?
Okay.
How they integrate their shadow.
Yeah, I knew it was gonna go the shadow, the dark part of ourselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I wrote like villains and death, like a lot of the times, I think especially during like the what's it called, the Renaissance, which is the Little Mermaid, like onward for a bit, every villain dies, but it's always justified, right? Like Ursula gets big, but then Eric kills her. Mm-hmm. Gaston stabs the beast, and then he falls off the ledge.
Yes.
I'm trying to think what else. Scar. I was like trying to remember all the movies in order. We look at like Mother Gothel, Entangled, like, and that's after Renaissance. So Disney fans, don't kill me because I know the difference. But I just think it's interesting how sometimes it's almost like the lesson that we're learning culturally, and I don't think Disney's not at fault for this, or these movies aren't at fault, but I think culturally what we tend to do is like, if people die, there needs to be a reason, right? And then when we lose people we love, there's no reason, so we don't know what to do with that. Yeah. And that's where I think these movies sometimes do a disservice, right? When the villain, like, oh, the bad guy has to die. Yeah. The bad guy's the hero in their own story.
Or, yes, and or how a good character has to die in a very like heroic way. Would you say that Disney has an issue with grief?
I would say that. I would say it's bigger than Disney, right? I would say culturally, we don't know how to deal with grief. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to process death. Yeah. And it's for the one thing that we all have in common, we have an awful time talking about.
It's interesting because a lot of the Disney movies have a kind of history. One of the things that I think I use with clients consistently is actually Snow White outside of Disney.
Okay.
Right. So all the different variations of it, but you hear how, in the tale, right, it ends with the Snow inviting the evil queen to her wedding, and then she dances to her death. And I heard a beautiful conversation about how Snow White resembles naivety and innocence, and how the evil queen multiple times actually like poisons her, and the doors always have to save her until this last fatal one. And I'm not sure, and this might be just in a version of the retelling. Yeah. But there was this therapist who talked about how in that bite of the apple, how the apple's actually in her mouth the whole time she's in crystallization, and she's digesting kind of the experience, and that allows her that when she comes back out, she gets saved and she gets married, that she has now digested some of what this attacker left, which was aggression. And this is the one time where she says, no, you know what, this is enough. Now, I think because stories back then probably weren't culturally shy to death.
No. I mean, most of the fairy tales, like if you read a lot of the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales,
yes,
they're really dark.
Yes,
they're very dark. They if we kind of talk about Joseph Campbell on stories, right?
Yeah.
That they were teaching a morality, a lesson about humanity. So they weren't Disneyfied.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah. Okay. So with that, let's move into the next section. Okay, guys, as we move into the last section of the podcast, I wanted to thank you again so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. And Alan and I've actually had a lot of fun doing these notes and reading comments and reviews. And if you are enjoying the podcast, please think about joining our Patreon page. What that does is you get early access to the podcast, you get behind the scenes show notes, along with we're going to be doing live sections and Q&As and all that fun stuff, so you get to know us better and you can ask questions, and the podcast will actually get shaped by our patrons. So if you can see that, it starts off as just little as $4 a month, which is less than a cup of coffee. So if you are enjoying this and you'd like to support us, we would very much appreciate that. And now with that, we will get back to the show. We're moving into the last little section about grief, and what better way than to talk about Avengers in probably the last 5-10 minutes of Infinity War, through Endgame, through Spider-Man Far From Home.
Yes. Like my eyes just honed in. I was like, it really is that long. You're just in grief from kind of that moment on. Well,
so spoilers if you've not. Honestly, I think if anybody's listening to this by this point, they should know. So, I think what Infinity War just knocks you on your butt with grief.
Yes, and
so I'll just. I know I can see you processing. So for me, we saw Infinity War. Half all the characters die, and you're like, what? And logically, I'm walking out of the theater. I can literally remember having this conversation. Well, obviously they're going to have to come back or do something because. Black Panther died and he just made $1 billion. They're not going to lose that. And Spider-Man's that's not going to happen, right? So logically I knew, but emotionally it was just I cannot believe
you're right.
That happened.
Yeah. So
the shock.
Yes. So if you're a comic book, and if you love comic books, you've gone through the woes of infinite timelines, time travel, different dimensions, all these different things. So you kind of have they're going to do this thing. But one, they stopped all the infinite timelines finally. And two, right? The shock of your characters that you've invested in, these stories, these narratives, they just abruptly ended.
Absolutely.
And as you talk about Bambi, as we talk about some of these other deaths, it's just it's so much, you just don't know what to say.
Well, it's boom, 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 boom.
Yeah,
so much.
They just flashed, right? Because it wasn't there wasn't heroic deaths for all these characters.
Not at all.
Right?
And that's what we're trained to know, right?
Yes.
What we were talking about earlier is that movies say if you're a hero, you have to have a heroic death, and none of these were heroic, right?
Yeah.
None of these they were all unjustified. But
my mind goes straight to Spider-Man. One, because he's my favorite, and two, just that line.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I don't feel so well. Boom, gone.
Yeah, I was seeing my own therapist at the time, and we did some dream work because I had a lot of anxiety about Infinity War because I didn't know who was going to die and I didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And I had to process a lot of the emotion in losing characters because there's something about being so connected to all these, and that movie really for that year, right, from the time Infinity War came out to Endgame, was a really challenging year to figure out what was going to happen and what to do. And there's just this overarching grief that I think the whole fandom was probably experiencing.
I just my mind just created a place for unjustified deaths.
Okay.
Or why we need justified deaths is because maybe it's hard for us to carry forward the characters in our minds because we haven't taken from them what we need yet.
Yeah.
And so Disney gives heroic deaths because it kind of shows us that we've gotten what we need from them, and they died heroically, imparting something to us. And I think that's something that collectively we felt or we didn't get with Avengers.
Yeah.
Because all these characters were just gone, and we weren't ready with their stories. We didn't get to see them conclude things, so we have all this unfinished business.
Which is why, if we fast forward to Endgame,
Yes,
I think Natasha, Black Widow, we can put in a different category.
Yeah.
But Steve Rogers, even though he doesn't die, he leaves.
Yeah.
And then Tony Stark dying at the end.
Yes.
Was like, it's still sad, but it's satisfying.
Yes, heroic.
Right? Yeah, because it was heroic. They've grown. They've learned.
I think even Natasha's, right? She died heroically, and we understand the sacrifice. That one might be a bit more sour than the others, but we understand why, Steve Rogers did what he did. We understand where Tony was. So to rewind a little bit, though, as we have all these characters, all these stories that were unfinished, we open up Endgame with group therapy.
Yeah.
Right? And the tone of the movie is half the population's just gone. They had a memorial, they had all these different things constructed. And they're talking about a new normal, which actually I think is really poignant, like in our times, this pandemic, right? Like we're all trying to find this new normal. How do we live knowing that these things can happen and have happened? We are being forced to live with this knowledge, and we have to kind of continue the story, or we get stuck.
Yep.
And so I think this is a topic that I love, and you're going to hear it for just a couple of minutes. Maybe we'll do a bigger podcast on it if we can find enough movies around it. Why we love the fantasy of time travel.
Okay.
Because as we talk about, all these characters are gone, and we know they're going to come back. Time travel. They're going to go back in time, something's going to happen.
Yeah.
Or, but I think that we love the idea and the fantasy, or at least I do, because it gives us this fantasy that things in the past can be corrected and we can live how we're supposed to live, right? But then we get stuck, right? That's also an addiction. It should have been.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to. What if I could?
Yeah.
And I think that this story kind of teases that, but it actually does a disservice by going back in time, because it doesn't let us sit with the losses. And this is where Marvel used to get a lot of criticism. It's like, how many times can you bring Wolverine and Jean Grey back? Like, Wolverine can't save every comic.
It's not Disney yet. Can't go there. No, you're 100% right. I think that when you just said time travel, it almost made me think that that's what we all like. I think most people love time travel stories.
Yeah.
Because it's what we wish we could do. We wish we could go back in and fix something we did.
Yeah.
Right? But the lesson for most time travel movies is you can't fix something you did. You have to learn to live with it, right? Yes. We have to go to the time travel almost in our head. Like, how do we learn? How do we grow? How do we mature from this?
Yes.
And I think when we are wanting to go back and fix things, which if we go back to the beginning of the podcast, Marlon, Eddie, everyone's they're stuck. And they want to go back and fix what happened versus saying, this is a thing that happened. How do I move forward? And I even maybe apply that to my family life. Mm-hmm. My dad was always typical guy, works a lot. Work was always a big priority. Yeah. And he is not giving work any extra time, anything right now, because he said, I wasted too much time with your mom and with you guys through my entire life, and I'm not going to do it anymore. Right? So in a way, a death for him caused him to get unstuck, to really prioritize what's important in life. Why sometimes we might experience grief, loss, trauma, and it causes us to get stuck. Mm-hmm. So we have to be really thoughtful about what is our trauma teaching us? What are we learning from it? How can we grow from it to become unstuck?
That we are going to face maybe these challenges that have been bubbling underneath the surface. And it sucks because we learn it through this. So I do that because there's a huge explanation that I don't know how I can get into. We learn this information through this experience. If you look at time travel paradoxes, there's no way for you to go back in time or have the ability to go back in time with the information you just got, because you only got it because the event happened.
Yep.
And so that's
the classic, the time machine, the classic.
Yes. And that's I didn't want to go into the whole narrative because I love that movie. But it's important for us to be able to understand that that lesson is for us now, and it wasn't for us before.
Yeah.
And we have so much shame because we say things like, I now realize that I need to maybe not emphasize work so much, and I need to be there with my friends and my family.
Absolutely. Well, that even from a bigger picture, that we tend to avoid. Okay, how can I say this the right way? This is what happens to me in session a lot. I'm like, oh, I have something really important to say, but I have to find the right language.
Yes.
Which is okay. We can slow down.
Yep.
It's going to come to me. I swear. Keep talking. Now.
I got it.
Okay.
It's important for us to be able to connect with our fantasy of time travel, because that's going to be our lesson. If we can reduce the shame of not knowing it before, because there was no reason for us to know that before. Before, our life was working and everything was in good enough balance. It's just no longer in good.
Yeah, that hit me. Okay, so I was like, good enough. There we go. That if we don't recognize that we have to go through struggles, we have to go through hard times to get to the place that we are now.
Yeah.
Right? That the only reason I'm a therapist today is because I worked for a decade in retail and managing stores and managing people, and I learned a lot of lessons, but I also burned a lot of bridges and had a lot of rough experiences, which molded me into the person I needed to be able to come back to therapy and do this, right?
Yeah.
I went to school to do it, took a break from it, came back. Yeah. And if I hadn't taken that path, I would not be nearly as good or successful as I am in my career path today. And I think that might be a really optimistic way to look at stuff, but I think it's an honest way to try to get through stuff, which is everything we go through, no matter how hard it is, how much hurt it is, how much pain it is, it's something that's influencing and teaching us, and we can grow from it.
Yeah. I would actually say, and this might be too forceful, we have to. Once that information comes up and we know these things exist, if we don't, we get pulled under.
It's almost like what Spider-Man has to do, right? If we maybe end on this, right? In Far From Home, is he has to deal with the reality that Tony died and he gets like this powerful weapon, right? That the reality is this is what's going on. You can either ignore it or deal with it.
Yes.
And I think sometimes we want to live in a world where we don't believe the reality exists. We want to make it something else.
Yeah.
And the hardest thing we have to do in life is to face, this is what the reality is. This is what's going on. This is what we have to do.
Interestingly enough, this is not where I intended to take it. I actually want to say that it would have been completely fine if Peter said, I'm done. And he forewent being Spider-Man, Spider-Monkey, or was it Night Monkey? What was it?
Yeah, Night Monkey.
Yeah. That he actually, it would have been okay if he said no. The issue was that when he said no, he didn't declare it. He let somebody else make the decision for him. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that was I think that's the lesson in this movie, is that if you're going to say no, if you're done, you said, I'm not doing this, you have to own that and you have to exclaim that. Just in the same way, if you're going to say, yes, I'll take on this mantle, I'll be the next Iron Man, right? Because then that's poignant. That's how the movie starts, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to be the next Iron Man? No, because I'm doing your job, right? In comic book-esque hero journey Disney, right? He is going to take on the mantle and he's going to be the new hero. But if he was to process and make that decision to not join in, it would have been fine. But we can't let people make decisions for us. We can't take the easy way out.
That really living a well-balanced, healthy, joyful life means we have to do the work. And doing the work means we're not always well-balanced. We're not always joyful, that we have to deal with hard stuff.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on any of the movies or Grief or anything else today that we talked about?
No.
Okay.
I think this was a lot heavier than I thought it was going to be, and I think that I got a lot of great insight. I got a lot from it.
Well, yeah, I think back, talking about this stuff feels so surreal, because I can remember taking a class in graduate school where we were trying to process grief type therapy, and I was like, I don't understand this, I don't get it. But at that point in my life, I hadn't really lost anyone close to me.
Yeah.
So I had no experience with it. So it was so far. So hopefully, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this and you've experienced some grief, that this is hopefully a comforting space to see that what the journey is and how it all affects us so differently, and we really have to own our own story. And if you're watching this and you've never experienced grief, If you've never experienced the loss, watching this can give you some insight into connecting to those who have, and maybe even preparing you for when that happens in your life, how to work through it.
And I know that, a question that you had asked earlier is just kind of what stories impacted them the most. But something that I kind of want to, as we kind of get towards wrapping up, that I want to leave is I want to hear how our conversations or our insights, or where we find ourselves therapeutically with this. I want to hear where it lands for you guys, because I would love to hear feedback on kind of who you guys are and what you respond to, because I want to be able to make sure that this is a conversation not just between us, but for others that's kind of over here.
Yeah.
We do this a lot. And I think it'd be great to be able to interact more with people about kind of what they're getting from this, so that we can be mindful of what content resonates.
So if you're listening to this, to follow up how to do that, if you're listening to this, you can go to the Disney Therapist podcast episode 7, and you can leave comments on our webpage that message us directly. You can tweet at us. You can DM us on Instagram, and or leave comments on YouTube. Whatever's easier. Just do what's easier. We're on all those platforms. Mm-hmm. We're not necessarily good at any one of them, but we have them all. So then that way, whatever is easiest for you, you can reach out to us. So we have all that stuff, so you can feel free. And I'm going to actually get Alan to get on all these things and post too, because mostly it's just me. But he's going to start too. So with all of that, please make sure you subscribe. Please make sure you leave 5-star reviews, comment, all that stuff, because it helps us grow, and that we're really starting just to see the podcast slowly start to grow and take off. And we just know that the more you like it, the better it is. So share it with your friends. Do all that stuff.
Right. And
Go ahead.
To tack on to that, right? I'm going, and this sounds so bad, but I'm going to be more encouraged to jump on and comment and do all these things if I have questions. I'm not good at initiating the conversation, but you get me going.
Yeah, you can talk.
I won't stop.
Which is interesting, because I can do that stuff. I can engage to begin with, but normally I'm such an introvert that I would never do that outside of this arena. It's kind of odd. But okay, that's enough about us today. So with that, we will see you guys next week. Bye.